In this lesson, we're going to take a look at looseness and dynamism in character drawing. And this theory really forms part of shape. So you want to think about this in terms of the shape category. All right, so you may have found that when you're drawing something, it may tend to look very stiff and kind of may lack dynamism just in its feel, right? And so there are two kind of categories that I want to talk about and want to teach you, that the one would be looseness and the other is dynamism, okay? And they're both applied in different ways. So let's talk about looseness first, all right? So looseness is very physical. So let's just write some notes here. Looseness, and I'll put dynamism on the other side. Okay. Looseness is about physicality, okay? And what I mean about that is literally your arm. Physicality. And dynamism is about movement and flow in shapes. Okay, so that's the basic theory of it. Okay, let's stick to the looseness side. So when you're drawing physical lines, like when you're physically drawing lines, when you draw lines slowly, so for example, I'll draw a line slowly here. Okay. Versus when I draw a line quickly, there is a fundamental difference between the two lines. Now, apart from straightness, right, that's the obvious difference. The one line has directionality and the other line sort of doesn't. So if you kind of look at the ends of this line over here, it kind of just ends, first of all. And second of all, because of its sort of wonky path, because I've drawn it slowly, it doesn't really appear like it's going anywhere. It seems very static, right? So this would be bad, right? We want loose lines. So in terms of looseness, what we have is a taper on each end, all right? And then a kind of a more arced appearance of the line, whether it's more or less straight, it doesn't matter. It's just very smooth. And what this means is that loose lines, and that therefore lines drawn quickly, they have a sense of directionality. So the lines seems to be moving this way and that way. Even more so when you start having curved lines drawn loosely, right, versus curved lines kind of drawn slowly. While you have now achieved a sense of directionality in the slower line because of the curve, right, you still lose the directionality at the end tapers. And then also these kind of little bumps and nooks and crannies along the way kind of disrupt the viewer's understanding of the flow of the line, right? Versus obviously these kind of beautiful tapers that you have on faster drawn lines and just a really smooth flow and uninterrupted sort of communication. Okay. So looseness is about drawing loosely physically. Now, you may have heard advice about people saying, you know, draw with your arm, don't draw with your wrist. And this is good advice, right? So definitely try and draw with your arm more for the bigger shapes. But of course, smaller shapes, you're going to need to use your wrist. But the idea is that you don't kind of pander to the lines in a way where you're kind of like, you know, hyper sketching like this, which this is called chicken scratch lines. You know, you don't want to draw like that. I mean, and nor do you want to draw really slowly like this, because you're losing dynamism, right? You're losing looseness in the lines. You want to really just kind of like be as quick as you can. I'm using shift key there, but it doesn't really matter. And yes, whilst you are having these overlaps, the shape feels more dynamic overall, right? And more appealing and also more professional looking. And that is one of the ways that people get a professional look in their work. It's by having very loose strokes. Now, incidentally, this also applies to painting, although depending on how you're painting, not necessarily the tapering part, but just being loose, physically loose. Okay, so when we talk about looseness, we're talking about physical looseness in your arm. And one of the key tenets of that really is drawing fast, okay? So I'm just going to write it down here. Draw fast or faster, right, if you're not that fast. Draw faster. And really kind of be loose. It can be hard to understand, but it's basically be physically loose. Okay, so be loose, draw faster. Okay, that is basically the theory of looseness. It's not hard to do, but you're going to need to practice this. So there will be practice exercises for looseness. Okay. Dynamism, on the other hand, is a completely different topic. It's not got to do with physicality. It's got to do with theory and understanding the difference between something that is static and something that is moving. All right. And just take that away. It's bugging me. Okay. So when we're talking about dynamism, right, I'll give you an example. Let's draw a triangle. Let's just pretend this is a perfectly symmetrical triangle, right? If I had to ask you what the directionality is in this triangle, you would probably say, well, it seems to be pointing out in all of these different directions, right? Which, you know, technically speaking, if that is indeed the case, it's not moving anywhere. It's kind of just staying here. There's kind of its center of motion, if you will, or it's, you know, it's not really moving anywhere. It's static. However, we took the triangle and we gave it a definitive direction, right? And notice how I've curved these sides, right? But more than that, we've given this triangle a definitive direction. It's definitely moving in that way. That shape has gone from being static, right, to a shape that has flow or movement. Some people will use the word energy, or, you know, it's got a kinetic energy, right? Now, you might be thinking, well, this is insane. How does this even apply to character drawing? So bear with me here. When you think about a character, a well-drawn character, in, say, a 3/4 angle, so they're not facing the camera front or side, they're kind of slightly rotated. The shapes that make up that character are largely asymmetrical. In fact, most of the time, they're all going to be asymmetrical. And asymmetrical basically means that though while we understand, say, human beings being symmetrical from left to right, for example, that when they're put into perspective and rotated, there is no symmetry in the shape. So understanding particularly that we want to have all of our shapes, our basic shapes, to read in this way, that they have directional flow, is extremely important. So let me give you a brief example. Let's use a cube. Let's say we decide, and we'll do this more in the anatomy section, so you'll see me doing it there. Let's say we decide, okay, we want to have some basic building blocks for the form of a human, right? So we say, okay, we're going to make the chest a block like this, right? So we're going to make it a square. So if you can imagine with me, you know, we might draw the head, and that's a bit weird proportionally, but anyway, and then we might draw some joints for the arms and have some spheres for the arms and stuff. But anyway, bear with me, this is like the Hulk here, but anyway, we're going to have this square. So we decide, okay, we're going to use this cube, as our base for the chest. That's all good and well, because we're getting the forms down. We can see that there are 3 sides to this cube, and that's great. But the problem is that this form now, right, lacks directionality in its shapes. So when you look at its shapes, which would be its different sides, there is no directionality. Now, don't get me wrong, don't hear me wrong here. I don't want you guys to build the forms in a way where you're kind of trying to turn each side into a directional shape. That would be weird. No. What you want to rather do is take that form, okay, and kind of start bending the form overall. Okay, so like you're curving the sides and you're kind of adding bend to its sides. Okay, here we're going to see the bottom of it instead of the top, but nevertheless the same thing applies. And you're getting a kind of a directionality, a directional movement through the form because you're bending the sides and you're adding movement to it. All right. And this is what dynamism means and what dynamic shapes mean, that you're ingesting life into these shapes. Now, you might say to yourself, well, where does this apply? Does this apply only to living things? Generally speaking, in the natural world, I would say definitely. And when I say living things, I don't just mean things that can move. It applies to trees, plants, anything that's alive, really, has some kind of directional flow. You know, things like mountains and things, you do want them to have directional flow in them because they were formed in some way via energy, right? I know that's kind of a bit weird, like esoteric and a bit out there, but nevertheless, the idea is that to a viewer, when they're seeing static shapes, it seems dull and without life. When they're seeing dynamic shapes, right, it seems to be alive, it seems to be moving, like there's life there, like there's motion. Okay, so let's just write here dynamic shapes and static shapes. So the idea is that you want to make sure in your art 99% of the time you're working with dynamic shapes all the time. Now, obviously this will differ if you're doing sort of a direct front view of a car, for example. You'll still want dynamic shapes, but obviously they're going to be mirrored left to right. You know, same thing with the side view. Granted, the side view generally has no parallels, no mirroring in it. But hopefully you understand this concept of dynamism. And we're going to be talking about this a lot as we move through, and you'll see how dynamism defines how we're going to draw all of our forms, right? We're going to make sure everything is dynamic all the time. Now, obviously, this is a character design course, so we're going to really be focusing and doubling down on how dynamism applies character design. And if you think of your typical human being, apart from when we're sleeping, although even when we're sleeping, but typically we're always moving, we're always balancing and counterbalancing. We're always experiencing the force of gravity and fighting against the force of gravity. And that then allows inside of us, we have this idea, what am I saying? What that means is that we have energy and directional flow moving in us all the time, balancing and counterbalancing. And so we need to, as artists, draw dynamic shapes all the time, right? So I want you guys to think about dynamic shapes and understand what makes the shape dynamic is that it has a directional flow to it, right? So for example, just a square, just reiterating here, this has no directional flow, but if we kind of bend the square in a weird way, suddenly it gains directional flow and it's more interesting to look at. Okay, that's it for looseness and dynamism. Let's move on.